dead of night, inside a house that no longer exists, footsteps walked a corridor that led nowhere. Not once, not twice, but over and over again, stopping outside a closed bedroom door, waiting in silence and then retreating. Multiple people heard them across separate visits. No one ever saw who was walking. No one ever opened that door. And when the building was finally torn down in the spring of 1936, the sound stopped completely, as though whatever had been pacing that hallway had been sealed inside the walls themselves. I want to begin this story differently than you might expect. Not with the house, not with its origins or its architecture or the slow creep of centuries across its foundations. I want to begin with a woman named Clara, arriving by carriage on a cold evening, carrying a small case, knowing nothing about where she was about to sleep. Clara had been invited as a guest to an old estate connected to church activities. She arrived in the early 1930s during one of those gray transitional periods when large country properties were being passed hand to hand like debts nobody wanted to settle. The building was functioning as a kind of informal guest house, hosting visitors affiliated with religious organizations. She had no prior relationship with the place, no expectations, no knowledge of its history or reputation. She was simply a woman who needed somewhere to stay for the night. Her room sat at the end of a long upper corridor, reached by a narrow staircase that groaned with every step. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, some leading to occupied rooms, others to spaces that smelled of dust and disuse. Small lamps cast disconnected pools of amber light along the passage, each one failing to reach the next, so that walking the corridor meant moving through alternating bands of dim glow and deep shadow. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. Sleep came easily. What followed did not. Sometime past midnight, Clara surfaced from sleep the way you sometimes do when the air pressure in a room shifts, or when a sound too faint to identify consciously registers somewhere deeper in the brain. She lay still, her eyes adjusted. The ceiling above her was featureless. The room was cold, but not unusually so. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Measured and deliberate, moving along the corridor outside her door. Not hurried, not hesitant. Each step landed with the full commitment of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The floorboards answered each stride with a creak that traveled through the walls and into the frame of her bed. Clara did not move. She tracked the sound as it passed other doors, pausing at some, bypassing others entirely. There was something selective about the movement, something that suggested attention. Whoever was walking was not merely passing through. They were reading the hallway, noting each door, making decisions she could not understand. The footsteps stopped directly outside her room. What followed was not silence, in the way we normally use that word. Silence implies absence. This was presence without sound. She could feel it the way you feel someone standing behind you in a queue. That displacement of air, that subtle alteration in the quality of stillness. Something was on the other side of the door, not moving, not knocking, not breathing audibly, simply occupying the space with an intensity that made the wood of the door feel thinner than it was. Clara held her breath. She waited for a knock, a voice, a handle turning. Nothing came. After what might have been 2 minutes, or might have been 10, the footsteps resumed. They moved away from her door and continued down the corridor until the sound dissolved into the deeper silence of the house. Clara exhaled. Her rational mind began its work. Another guest, restless and wandering. A staff member on late rounds. Someone confused by the labyrinthine layout, turning back after reaching a dead end. She was nearly asleep again when the footsteps returned. This time they came faster. No pauses at other doors. Straight to hers. And stopped. The same weighted stillness. The same held breath of the corridor itself. And then, after a long interval, the retreat. The measured walk back toward wherever the sound originated. This cycle repeated throughout the night. Approach, stop, silence, retreat. Approach, stop, silence, retreat. The rhythm never varied, the pace never changed. There was no escalation, no attempt to enter, no vocalization of any kind. Just the mechanical repetition of a route being walked by something that could not or would not deviate from it. Clara said afterward that fear was not quite the right word for what she felt. Fear implies a threat you can orient yourself toward. This was more like vertigo. The growing recognition that the behavior on the other side of the door did not conform to any human logic she could access. A person who wanted entry would try the handle. A person who was lost would speak. A sleepwalker wouldn't return to the same door with surgical precision every single time. The consistency was the thing that crawled under her skin. The footsteps were too perfect, too faithful to their own pattern. At some point before dawn, she got out of bed. She crossed the room on bare feet and placed her palm flat against the door. She was not reaching for the handle. She was testing for presence, warmth, vibration, anything that would confirm a body standing inches away on the other side. The wood was cold, inert, but the footsteps, which had been clearly audible seconds earlier, stopped the instant her skin touched the surface, as though her touch had been noticed, as though whatever walked that corridor had been aware of her all along and was now waiting to see what she would do. She did not open the door. Something primitive and wordless held her in place. Not panic, not indecision, a deep animal certainty that the door was a boundary she must not cross. She pulled her hand away, returned to bed, and waited for the sound of morning. Dawn brought voices, kitchen noises, the careless footsteps of living people. Clara caught her 6 o'clock coach and said nothing to anyone. Now I want to pull back and talk about the building itself, because the building matters. Not as a backdrop, as a participant, the estate sat on land in the outskirts of a European city whose edges had been shaped less by urban planning than by inheritance, upheaval, and the slow transfer of property from institutional to private hands. The ground beneath the house had been worked for centuries before anyone thought to build a gentleman's residence on it. Farming tenants had lived and died there without leaving records. The earliest structures were functional, utilitarian, built to serve the land rather than the people on it. When the property eventually passed into private ownership, successive families did what families always do with inherited architecture. They changed it. They extended walls, added wings, raised new staircases, bricked up windows, and carved doorways through load-bearing stone. No single architect ever held the full picture. Each generation built onto what the previous one had left. And the result, after 300 years, was a house that had lost its own internal logic. Corridors doubled back on themselves. Rooms opened onto other rooms that belonged to different centuries. Stairwells connected floors at unexpected angles. Visitors routinely got lost. Not in the charming way people get lost in country houses during weekend parties. Lost in the disorienting way you get lost when the geometry of a building stops making spatial sense. I recognize this quality because I have felt it in other places. Years ago, I stayed for a long weekend in a converted textile mill in the north of England. The building had been a factory, then a warehouse, then apartments, then abandoned, then converted again into some kind of artist residency. By the time I arrived, the internal layout bore no relationship to the original design. I slept in what had been a drying room. The hooks were still in the rafters. The proportions were wrong for a bedroom, the ceiling too high, the walls too close, as though the room remembered being something else and resented its current use. That is what buildings like this do to you. They refuse to let you forget that you are temporary and the structure is not. The estate carried this quality in abundance. And the corridor where Clara heard those footsteps was perhaps its most concentrated expression. It sat on the upper floor, a long passage that had been extended and modified so many times that its proportions felt alien. Too narrow for its length, too dark for its number of windows. The ceiling height changed partway along, evidence of two construction periods meeting imperfectly. Walking it during the day felt, slightly wrong. At night, it must have been unbearable. Several weeks after her first visit, Clara returned to the estate. She had not planned to mention her experience. Daytime passed without incident. The house in sunlight was merely old, merely confusing, merely large. That evening at dinner, conversation turned, as it inevitably does in places like this, toward the character of the building. A retired military officer asked the owner whether the house was haunted. The question was half joking. The answer was not. Family members began sharing stories that had circulated for generations. Sounds in the upper corridors that could not be traced. A heavy dragging noise, like furniture being moved across bare boards, heard repeatedly in rooms that contained nothing movable. The persistent feeling of being observed in certain parts of the house, always the same parts, regardless of who was visiting or when. Someone noticed that Clara had gone white. When pressed, she described her night. The footsteps, the stopping, the waiting, the mechanical repetition that continued until dawn. She spoke carefully without embellishment, the way people do when they're afraid of not being believed. What happened next transformed her account from anecdote into something harder to dismiss. Others at the table began to speak. A second guest described hearing the same footsteps during a stay months prior. A third confirmed it. Then a fourth. The details aligned in ways that coordination could not easily explain. The pauses at specific doors, the return to the same spot, the dragging noise, the abrupt silence when attention was paid. Each person had experienced these things alone, during separate visits, in different rooms along the same corridor. Most had told no one until that moment. Staff were questioned. None admitted to walking the upper corridor at night. None had reason to. The corridor S2 access points both required passing through occupied areas or descending stairs that would have produced additional noise nobody ever reported hearing. The phenomenon appeared sealed within that single passage, operating on its own schedule, indifferent to the calendar or the identity of the occupants. The estate had accumulated other stories over the years, as old properties always do. There was an old mirror in one of the lower rooms, heavy and dark framed, the kind of glass that seems to hold more shadow than the room it reflects. People who stood before it sometimes reported movement in the reflection that had no counterpart in the physical space behind them. Not a face, not a figure, a disturbance, a thickening of the air inside the glass, as though something occupied the mirror-esque version of the room that did not exist in the real one. Turning around revealed nothing. Facing the glass again, the impression returned. Faint but insistent. There were also older oral traditions, tied to the grounds rather than the house. A particular path along the property-s edge carried stories of a hooded figure seen near a stone boundary marker. Descriptions varied across decades, but the core was consistent. A man in dark robes, standing motionless, face obscured or disfigured, never speaking, never sitting, never interacting with witnesses in any way. He appeared, occupied a space, and then was not there anymore. Nobody connected him to a specific death or crime. He seemed to belong to the land rather than to any human story, like geological feature that happened to wear a human shape. And there was the Green Lady, seen inside the house, always peripherally, always briefly. The flash of green fabric disappearing through a doorway. The outline of a woman at the far end of a passage, gone before the eye could focus. The feeling of having just been in a room with someone who should not have been there. She was never central to the estate's reputation. She existed alongside it, the way certain colors exist alongside others in a painting, present but not dominant, contributing to an overall impression without demanding individual attention. I keep returning to the restraint of the people involved. Clara did not dramatize. She did not construct a theory. She described what she heard with the precision of someone recounting a traffic accident, sticking to sequence and sensation, refusing to fill gaps with speculation. The others who spoke at that dinner table did the same. They were not building an argument. They were comparing experiences the way neighbors compare weather. Quietly, practically, aware that the thing they were discussing did not owe them an explanation. No one performed experiments. No one attempted to provoke or trap whatever walked that corridor. No one demanded the story resolve into something neat. The house was discussed the way you discuss a neighbor whose behavior you cannot predict, with caution, with attention, without the pretense of understanding. And then the house was demolished. 1936. Stone by stone, the structure was reduced to rubble and cleared away. The land was absorbed into the surrounding neighborhood. Streets covered the footprint. New buildings rose where old walls had stood. The sound stopped, not gradually, not partially, completely. Nothing transferred to neighboring structures. Nothing followed former occupants to their new addresses. Nothing manifested on the open ground where the corridors had been. The phenomenon did not migrate. It did not adapt. It ended with the finality of a door being shut in a room that no longer exists. This is the detail that sits with me longest. Not the footsteps, not the mirror, not the hooded figure on the path. The completeness of the ending, because it suggests that whatever was happening inside that house was not anchored to memory, to trauma, to unfinished emotional business carried forward by the living. It was anchored to the structure, to the specific arrangement of stone and timber and plaster that had been shaped and reshaped across centuries until the building's internal logic had become its own thing entirely, unrelated to the intentions of anyone who had ever lived there. We tend to think of haunting as something the dead do to the living, but what if certain arrangements of space accumulate their own momentum? What if a corridor walked by enough feet across enough decades, develops a kind of kinetic memory, a groove worn so deep into the fabric of the building that it continues to play even after the last human foot has left. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something more like an echo that has forgotten it is an echo and now believes it is the original sound. I do not ask you to believe that. I am not sure I believe it myself, but I think it is worth holding in your mind as you consider what Clara heard that night and what everyone else at that dinner table recognized in her description. They were not frightened people looking for monsters. They were observant people confronting the limits of observation itself. The house is gone, the corridor is gone. The footsteps have no floor to walk on. And still the story persists, passed from account to account, because the people who experienced it did something remarkably difficult. They told the truth about what they could not explain without pretending they could explain it. They left the gap open. They trusted us to sit in it without rushing to fill it with comfortable conclusions. The stories that endure are rarely the ones with the most dramatic revelations. They are the ones that leave you standing at a threshold you never quite cross, hand pressed flat against cold wood, listening to something on the other side that knows you are there and has no intention of telling you what it is.